Welcome to the Mukilteo Football Show. My name is Miles. Episode number 1. I was going to save the launch of the Mukilteo Football Show until after the NFL rookie draft. But I wanted to come and sort of have episode 1 be a tribute to my Grandma Shirley, who passed on Wednesday after a long and great life. She is the reason for the name, her and my mom. The Mukilteo Fantasy Football League is how I started, and kind of I wanted to pay tribute to that with a new show. Now, the football aspect in Mukilteo goes back to 76. So it's, I guess the first episode is really about appreciation, because not very many 35-year-olds have played 20 years of fantasy football with their grandma. It is a unique situation. I never consciously joined football or fantasy football. I was born into it. I lived a fantasy draft every year of my life. Christmas, Thanksgiving, birthday, draft day. These things were all happening from my birth year until I started noticing that these things were yearly. It was one of the holidays, late summer, the football drafts. In the early 90s, when I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, they would come to our house. So they would be at my house. My mom was the commissioner. Mom and grandma were sort of the leaders of it. Everybody would come over. There'd be this big party, drinking and fun. It was not on the internet. Fantasy football wasn't at that point. So they would have these giant papers with each round writing down in Sharpie. So they'd just write 1 down to 12, and they'd write, they'd pencil in Dan Marino, and then they would pick number 2 for this guy, and they'd write his name in there, Jerry Rice. So, and then they would take those papers down and they would start a next round, and round 1, round 2, round 3, they would be taped up on the walls of the house. So as a kid, I didn't really know what was going on. I didn't have any football advice between Mark Duper and Mark Clayton. So my job was mostly, I guess one of my jobs was getting ice or getting drinks for people. But another one of my jobs as I got older and as I learned to read was going around looking at the rounds on the wall to see, where somebody missed crossing a guy off of their cheat sheet. So I'd be the spotter. I'd be going down the hallway. Oh, there he is. There he is. Somebody took Icky Woods right here. You forgot to cross him off. That was my job. And grandma and mom, they always laughed about it. They pointed out how the first round would be so meticulously written, and the last round would be a drunken scribble Phoenix Cardinals defense. Houston Oilers kicker. I don't even know the guy's name. It's probably Al Del Greco, by the way, but that is a random thing. So, and I think I've always remembered that, obviously, was a big holiday. Another real thing that kept it in my mind is that, remember, it was at our house. We lived there after, and those papers, those rounds, they would stay up on the walls. They would stay up on the walls for weeks, for almost a month. Basically, one by one, the tape would give way and gravity would prevail. So it's just really special, really unique to have fantasy football in my life in this way, for it to be through my mom and my grandma, two women who were more about the social aspect of it than the obsessive, statistic aspect, but it was important to them as a thing to talk about it. Just how many people have a fantasy start like this? So this one is about 4 Grandma Shirley stories that I got after my years of playing with her. Like I said, she was never really a big nerd, never really obsessive fantasy football, but she did win a couple times, and those are 2 of the stories that we'll go through. She went with her gut. She had just her magazine and her newspaper, and she'd have pen marks, on certain people that she liked, and she would make the same joke every draft. Don't look at my picks. Don't open up that magazine. I don't want you to see my picks. So it was always funny. She just had a lot of loyalty. It kind of reminded me of horse racing. You'd come in with your parlay, and you'd write it down in the newspaper and stuff like that. That was kind of her approach to fantasy football. It really was. That league is so old. It's a 1976 league. It was mostly touchdown only at that point. They did add yards later, but it was more like a way to graduate from gambling on the game to gambling on who would score the touchdown. So it was always rooted in gambling more than it was forming a team and pretending to be a general manager and all these things that we have now with these dynasty leagues and half PPR and PPR, or as Mom and Grandma called it, a point for everybody wants a point for putting on the helmet. So 4 Grandma Shirley football stories. And I'm going to start with number 1 here. And it is the 1998 Minnesota Vikings. I graduated from drink and ice fetcher and player spotter when I was 13, and Grandma and I were on a team in 1998. This was my first ever fantasy season. I was 13. I went to Grandma's team. I was on it for 4 years. So everybody has their chance to kind of become addicted to fantasy football or football in general. For fantasy football, this was my moment. This was the moment where I did good, and I got to feel how exciting that was and chase that feeling ever since. The highlight of the year was that we drafted rookie Randy Moss, who, I still have the magazine, Fantasy Football Index 1998. He's ranked 54 on the cheat sheet, so we definitely didn't draft him early. I don't have the actual draft, but we drafted rookie Randy Moss, and he was a stud. He was the wide receiver 1 that year. 1,300 yards, 17 touchdowns. My favorite memory is the famous Thanksgiving game against the Cowboys, in which he scored 3 huge plays, 177 yards on like 3 catches. And that was perfect for us because we weren't really sitting down and grinding the tape, Grandma and I. We needed the highlights. I was a kid, she enjoyed the social fun of Thanksgiving. So to just be able to just pop on and see those 3 plays and see how many points they added up to, that was so fun. And sadly, it's really one of the only in-person memories I have with Grandma watching a fantasy football success or a football success in person. The much more common scenario for us over this 4 years was Mom and Grandma would be talking on the phone. They'd talk on the phone for hours, and Mom would need to go change the dishwasher or go to the bathroom or go, switch the laundry or something like that. And she would hand the phone to me, and then I would talk to Grandma, for fantasy football corner, and we would talk about our team, and we didn't really talk a lot about activations. Our philosophy was, are they hurt? No, then they're playing. We also did a fantasy basketball league, as I recall, and we got second place. We had Gary Payton, supersonic, way past his prime. Wasn't supposed to be doing that good, and he did really good. So we were proud of that. So the 1998 Vikings, not only did we have Randy Moss, we had Robert Smith, their running back, who was a top 12 running back that year. So we were really in on the 15-1 Vikings team that was just doing so good with Randall Cunningham, and they were in the dome there, and it was a new team after years of 49ers, Cowboys, Buffalo, and Denver. It was I guess Denver was still there, but it was just it was new, it was fresh, it was fun. And we got to enjoy it almost as if it was our home team. You're watching Robert Smith and Randy Moss get points. At the time, I cared about the points. I cared about the standings. I cared about the excitement of it. But now I treasure that it was with Grandma, and that was a lot of fun. Our other 3 years weren't as successful. Maybe that Gary Payton pick was a monkey's paw. It made us think that we should be drafting guys past their prime against the advice of the generic fantasy resources. Because we drafted Jerry Rice in '99. He was 37 years old. It was the first year in 2 decades that San Francisco was bad. It's like, come on. We also drafted Trent Green, 1999. That is right. St. Louis Rams quarterback Trent Green. We drafted him in 1999. He tore his ACL in week 3 of the preseason. We did not pick up Kurt Warner. So we did not get that season that he then went on to, the NFL MVP, grocery store employee to NFL MVP, captain of the greatest show on turf, changed the league. That would have been great, but we didn't think of that. I remember having a lot of Ricky Watters, when he was on the Seahawks and getting older. I also remember our final year, we were really into Dante Culpepper. I got the magazine right here for the YouTube listeners. I don't think we read past the cover of the magazine. We drafted him either first or second overall, but he got hurt, so we didn't do very good that year. That was 2001, I believe. So that is the first story of Grandma. Let's go to number 2. Number 2 is Grandma's first win. So after 2002. Or after 2001, then she gets her own team from then on. I went to Mom's team and eventually my own team. And so Grandma had her own team from then on. A lot of help she would get from her sons and her grandsons. And she would just kind of be the league corner there, rolling down and keeping it steadfast for 18 more years. After already having drafted for 12 years. So, story 2 is her first victory, 2006, defeating Tomlinson. So, I would describe Grandma's fantasy style as I did, with the horse racing, the pens, the markers, just kind of had her guys. She just extreme loyalty to players that she either liked their name or liked watching them or had heard about them in a way or had them before and wanted them again. Just some names I can remember. She liked Fred Taylor, Joe Horn, Ike Hilliard, Ed McCaffrey, yes, that's the wide receiver for New York and then San Francisco and then Denver. That is Christian McCaffrey's dad. We are old. Randall Cobb, Deuce McAllister. She loved Tony Romo. And of course Doug Baldwin. Her married name being Baldwin, or cousin Doug, as she would say, Doug Baldwin. She drafted him way too early, all the time. She had him like 3 or 4 years in a row in which the fantasy magazines probably wouldn't have even recommended him being drafted at all. And then one of those years, she drafted him like the 4th or 5th round, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and he scored 14 touchdowns. And every other fantasy outlet, this is 2015, every fantasy podcast is saying, got to pick up Doug Baldwin. Somebody's got to pick up Doug Baldwin. Not in our league. Grandma drafted him in the 3rd. Just complete loyalty to the names and that she loved. No worry about average draft position. So 03, 04, 05, those were good years for her. But 06 is her first win. So going back one year to 2005, she got 4th place. So she was in a good place. She had Tomlinson in 05, and she had Steven Jackson, St. Louis Ram running back, and Willie Parker, Pittsburgh running back. So she had 3 of the top 12 running backs that year in 2005. And we get to do the 2006 draft, and she basically tries to redraft her exact team. So she couldn't get Tomlinson because he was probably the 101 or 102 that year in 2006. But she does redraft Steven Jackson and Willie Parker, who do even better because all 3 of those running backs are top 4 running backs in our scoring. So she has 2 of the top 4 running backs. She's near at the top of the standings again. She's got a chance to win it this time. But the thing is, the team that has LaDainian Tomlinson this year, In 2006, anybody with fantasy leagues that go back this far know what I'm getting to here. Going against 2006 LaDainian Tomlinson, it was not really possible, especially in this league, which is a cumulative scoring league. Don't want to get into all the details of the scoring, but it is a cumulative league, not head-to-head. So Tomlinson was an absolute monster season. 33 total touchdowns. 33. There are 16 games. 33 touchdowns, 28 rushing, 3 receiving, 2 passing, 2,300 yards. He had 4 weeks with 3 touchdowns. He had 3 weeks with 4 touchdowns. It was insane. And by any metric, any way you shape the numbers, try to adjust for era, try to adjust for points per game, try to adjust for PPR, half PPR, non-PPR, all the scorings you can, no matter what you do, no matter how you shift it, Tomlinson is the number 1 running back fantasy season of all time. You cannot slice it any other way. So how did Grandma win this year? Especially in a touchdown-heavy league. She defeated Tomlinson, who was on the team called Soup Nazis. That is a Seinfeld reference, by the way, just in case anybody thinks we have some sort of fascist soup thing going on. No, that's a Seinfeld reference. So she was taking on Soup Nazis, who had Tomlinson, who had a decent team outside of him, had Frank Gore that year. I know Frank Gore's still going, but at the time he was a hot young 10-touchdown running back on San Francisco. So how did Grandma win? This was a dusty memory for me, so I really dived into the archives and determined the big factors. First major factor of how Grandma pulled off this victory over the juggernaut Tomlinson season, Steven Jackson. Steven Jackson surely did not compare to Tomlinson. And I'm not saying he did. Tomlinson is the unequivocal number 1 fantasy season of all time, total points, setting apart, adjusted across era. It's no contest. Now, thing is, Steven Jackson had a monster year this year. He had the 18th best fantasy season of all time in the same year alongside Tomlinson. Now, there's a big gap between the two, but as far as somebody to have to kind of mitigate the damage, having the 18th best fantasy running back season of all time, Steven Jackson on the St. Louis Rams, that definitely helped put her in a position to make up ground in some other areas. Like I said, Willie Parker was one of those areas. Grandma's RB2, Willie Parker for Pittsburgh, fresh off crushing our Seahawk hearts in the 2005 Super Bowl. That did not dissuade her from drafting him in 2006. Because remember, Parker had this 75-yard touchdown run in the Super Bowl against the Seahawks. Still the longest Super Bowl run in history. Anyway, so Grandma had him. He had 16 touchdowns. So I talked about Frank Gore. It's actually 9 touchdowns. Parker had 16 touchdowns. So really made up some ground there. Parker and Jackson, the couple of Davids against the Goliath Tomlinson season. More St. Louis magic. Torrey Holt. Grandma had Torrey Holt. So when Steven Jackson didn't score, Torrey Holt did. So she was getting a lot out of that Scott Linehan, Mark Bulger offense. Whatever. But the biggest reason that she won, the biggest area of advantage was at quarterback. Because Soup Nazis had Brett Favre, who was doing okay. He was having one of those middling seasons. I think that's the second to last Packer season. And Soup Nazis also had rookie Matt Leinart, who was a total, complete bust. So who did Grandma have that gave her enough overage to counterweight and defeat the Tomlinson season? Well, it was a short, scrappy, free agent coming off shoulder surgery, joining a historically bad franchise in a city ravaged by hurricane. Yes, Grandma's true 2006 hero was the recently retired, this week, Drew Brees. In his first year in New Orleans, he started there, and as it continued for 15 years, he was a statistical monster. And she drafted him in the mid round. I think she drafted him as her QB too, but started him the whole time. So Breeze has retired, and in honor of this, I'm assuming somebody passed on the word of Grandma's passing to Drew Brees, and he said I could finally hang it up. So that is how Grandma overcame the legendary 2006 Tomlinson season for her first fantasy football championship. Story number 3. 2010, Arian Foster. So she had a few good seasons in between here, 07, 08. Maurice Jones-Drew was a big part of it. Grandma loved Jaguars running back. So it went from Taylor to MJD. She also loved Rivers. 2010, she made what appeared to us at the time. This is really a story of the draft day itself, more than the season. She made what appeared at the time to be the most baffling reach that we had ever seen. Myself, my friend Anthony, my brother Kirk, we were sitting in a booth at the Maxie's Chinese restaurant and bar, which is where we started having the drafts in the 2010s. And Grandma in the 3rd round takes what to us looks like the 3rd string Houston Texans running back, Arian Foster. For us, it was inexplicable, especially with Steve Slayton on the board. Anthony leans over to us and says, "Man, I feel sorry for your grandma." And we all agreed. We're like, "Man, yeah, that is so bad." But in this case, Grandma was way ahead of us. Why? First, because she was going off of the newspaper, which had more data about Slayton and Ben Tate. Because this whole Houston thing was a mess. You know, I pulled out the fantasy index here as well, the 2010 magazine, and what we were going off of wasn't current enough. It said if there's a 1,000-yard back on this roster, it's not clear who it is: Tate, Foster, or Steve Slayton. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at this 3-headed monster nobody knows. But Grandma had the newspaper. The current newspaper, who knew that Arian Foster was better. And I'm sure help from Uncle Daryl or from Uncle Guy as well. But she had that. She picked Arian Foster. Everybody's going down their cheat sheets, crossing off Foster when Slayton, this darling fantasy guy, is still up there. Didn't have a great year last year, but he's only his 3rd year. And Ben Tate's up there, and everyone's thinking, Grandma. I can honestly say it's the first time I've ever heard the name Arian Foster. Maybe that's a reflection on me, and that was the darkest time of my fantasy football. But everybody was just flummoxed. The thing is, we should not have been, because Arian Foster, this 3rd, 4th round pick, came out of nowhere to be the RB1, 2,200 yards, 18 touchdowns. One of the very best fantasy seasons of all time. And very few of those top of the top fantasy seasons come out of the blue like that. Some fantasy seasons are remembered that way. You know, Peyton Hillis, C.J. Anderson. There's a few other, Justin Forsett. There's a few rookies as well that come out that we remember in our fantasy collective as, wow, he came out of nowhere. But he didn't go that high. They didn't go up into the top 50 of all time. They didn't do that good. Nowhere near 2,200 yards and 18 touchdowns. No, this was stunning. And the guys that Foster is with, on equivalent seasons, none of them were surprises at all. Tomlinson, Emmitt Smith, Marshall Faulk, Priest Holmes, Peterson, David Johnson, all these guys are early 1st-round picks. So great years, but nobody was surprised by them. This Foster season stands alone. It stands alone as reaching that echelon of one of the greatest seasons of all time. Still nowhere near Tomlinson, by the way. None of them are. But while being one of those greatest seasons of all time, also being out of nowhere, appearing to be out of nowhere. So the fact that season and that moment in the draft is associated with my grandma. I always, I guess I just need to read the newspaper. Of course, then Twitter started, and then we have Twitter. So, She got 7th that year, so it wasn't like it was a big storybook thing. So she made some other picks that maybe didn't spin well. Partly Eli Manning, grandma's trust in guys. She really liked Arian Foster and tried to get him every year. He started becoming a 101, but she also really liked Eli Manning, and that loyalty was misplaced. I'm sorry, Grandma. Story number 4. 2014 victory after 3 last place. So Grandma is going up and down at this point. 2011 last place, 2012 last place, 2013 last place. Again, two of those years she had Eli Manning. So a lot of Eli Manning here. She got Eli Manning's receivers. She got Nix, Cruz, Manning. Not saying they were doing terrible, but they certainly weren't doing enough. And she had the ghost of Miles Austin, both 2 of those years. She got bad luck. Matt Forte, Pro Bowl. She drafted him in the first round. He made the Pro Bowl, but he only got 4 touchdowns. And in our scoring, that's basically nothing. And then she drafted sophomore Andrew Luck in 2013. Promising, but he did not really add up the fantasy points that she got last that year. So 3 years of bad luck, last place. The karma somehow paid forward all at the same time in 2014, because she goes into this draft, she redrafts Andrew Luck in the first round. Absolutely did not need to take Andrew Luck in the first round, by the way. He had a pretty bad year, but she liked Andrew Luck. She's taking Andrew Luck. Drafts him in the first round, redrafts Matt Forte. So she's drafting the people she had on her last place teams. And crushes us with this team that she builds underneath it. And I don't mean, this is not like 2006 where she pulled out the victory. This year, it was just like a storm of good luck waved over Grandma. She won, and then the second best team in the league was her bench. It was her starters and her bench, and then me, because I was the one who got second place, third place if her bench would have counted. I mean, it was ridiculous. She had Luck. She had Romo, who was throwing 34 touchdowns. He had to sit on the bench. She had Forte, and then she had 3 more RB1s. So she just hit on everything. Lamar Miller, Mark Ingram, CJ Anderson. This is the 2014 fantasy season, by the way. So Forte, Miller, Ingram, Anderson, who she picked up with the help of Uncle Daryl, I believe. So all 4 of those running backs finished top 12 running backs per points per game. So, and I know, not fluky points per game. Every time you hear someone say that stat, you think, oh, okay, so one of them only played 7 games. No, they all played 13 to 16 games. So she's got a full 1/3 of the top 12 running backs in 2014. That leaves 8 other RB1s for the other 11 teams. She's got 4 of them. On her bench with Romo, who was throwing a ton of touchdowns. She had Randall Cobb. She had, that was Randall Cobb's one good year. She had Golden Tate, that breakout in Detroit with a lot of touchdowns. And she had Victor Cruz. Yes, still on the Eli Manning train. But this one turns into something really good, something that helps push her up even better. Because with my help, she drops Victor Cruz for a rookie, Odell Beckham Jr. It happened during the Week 6 Monday Night Football. I remember the night really well. I went over to Grandma's to watch Monday Night Football. Not something I remember doing a lot. Mom was a good daughter because she would say, stop off at Grandma's, you got to watch football with Grandma or something, like something like that. And I would go do it. So we were watching that game, Giants versus Eagles. It was a blowout. I don't think the Giants scored any touchdowns. Victor Cruz got hurt, and I had picked up Odell Beckham Jr. in my other league with my friends, which is another major league. I had picked him up the week before. So I said to Grandma, hey, that looks like a season-ending injury. They're carting Victor Cruz off, and I know you've had Victor Cruz for the last 4 years, but I think he's done. You should pick up Odell Beckham Jr. And at that time, you could pick him up just in the middle of the game because without getting into the scoring of this league, but it is, you could pick up your guy at any time because you have to pay to pick up a guy. It's $5 to add and drop. So you could do that. And so we went over to her computer. We did it. Computer's running slow. Another thing mom would do is send me over to see why grandma's computer was running slow. And it was fantasy football related, because what she would do is she had a virtual deck of cards, and she had fantasy football lineup machine where she clicked the E, typed in CBS Sportsline, and set the lineup. The problem is that's what she did every time. So no closing of the browsers. If she needed to set her lineup, she needed to click the E, type in CBS Sports. So I would go over there and there'd be like 20 tabs open, all with their ads running, because the last 20 weeks of fantasy football or whatever. So we closed them out. She always said, I didn't want to hit the X. I didn't want to break it. So anyway, we picked up Odell Beckham Jr. She held on to him, and he was insane the last 6-7 weeks of the year. So she was already crushing us. Remember, she had the top 2 of the top 5 quarterbacks and 4 of the top 12 running backs and good receivers. Her wide receiver 3 becomes this Odell Beckham Jr. who starts averaging 150 yards and a touchdown and a half every game. Absolute, complete, total domination. No one is even checking the standings. Grandma had won. It was fun. And before anyone thinks like I was colluding, first of all, you help your mother, you help your grandmother. That's what my mom would say. Also, I was the one who got second place. So I would be the one who had to complain. And grandma really didn't even need Odell Beckham Jr. I did the math on this. She could have sat her players. She won without getting really into the scoring, cumulative scoring. She could have sat her players week 16 and 17. And I could have gotten the league record points in week 16 and 17, and she would have still won. So, it was a crazy year after 3 last places. That's how it's very memorable, very fun. It's one of the things I wanted to share with everybody. That's how good her 2014 Luck, Romo, Forte, Miller, Ingram, Anderson, Cobb, Tate, Beckham Jr. team. How good that was. And one of the things I love about fantasy football is just how it becomes something more, how it tallies along with my life. Those players mean my grandma to me. And that's what grandma and mom loved about it too. It was a social thing. It was an engagement. It was something to talk about. They never got obsessively into it. It was social gambling, and it was fun. And it's pretty incredible to me how it spans your life. 1998, Randy Moss, grandma and I are watching a generational rookie phenom do all this. I'm in 8th grade. And then it's 16 years later, grandma and I are watching a generational rookie phenom, Odell Beckham Jr. I'm a newlywed. I'm about to be 30, about to buy a house, and we're still doing that, and it just kind of goes along with your life. And so that is really special. And one of the reasons I named this show the Mukilteo Football Show, because she's an old Mukilteo person. She grew up in Mukilteo. She loved it. It's a great name. You see the pictures in the YouTube video that I'm using. Those are mostly from her house, the old family house. So just wanted to do that. The episodes that I will do, 1 a week from here to the season, try to have some guests, try to go back into NFL history, go current NFL analysis, dabble into fantasy quite a bit, just whatever we can do. So subscribe on YouTube, do whatever you do. I'll work out that spiel later. This is episode 1, and this has been for Grandma Shirley Fantasy Football Stories. I'm Miles. Thanks.